Hello, everyone. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. We've been on break for a bit. The last you probably heard from us was in December 2022, when we had two conversations, one about our top 10 books of the year, and the other with our critics Dwight Garner, Jen Zalai, and Alexandra Jacobs. They spoke about some of their favorite books of the year. We're happy to be back. I'm here with Tina Jordan, who is the deputy editor of the Book Review, to talk about just a few of the big books that are coming out over the next several months. Hello, Tina.
Hey, Gilbert.
Thank you for doing this.
It's my pleasure.
So before we get into the actual books that you're going to talk about, I would love to give our listeners a sense of what we actually mean when we say big books. As we both know, because we work in the Book Review, there's so many books released every week, every month. But we're probably just going to talk about 8 or 9 here. So my first question is, when I say big book, when you say big book, when people in the publishing industry say big book, what does that actually mean?
It can mean a couple of things. It can mean, first, a new book from a well-known and much-loved author, especially someone who hasn't published in a while. It can mean what we refer to in the industry as a make book, which I'm sure you're going to want to ask me about. Or in the case of the Book Review, it can mean a book by an author most people haven't heard of, but which the editors on the desk have read and been blown away by. And let me give you an example. Years ago, Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11 was a book like that. The editor who was previewing it for the Book Review read it, passed it around, and said, "You guys have to read this." And it was forecast as one of our big books before it had ever appeared.
You mentioned a make book, which is an industry term. A lot of people listening to this podcast are in the industry. Many of them are also not in the industry. What does it actually mean?
So a make book is a book a publisher has usually, although not always, spent a great deal of money for and earmarked a lot of money for a marketing campaign. In other words, they are going to get the news out about this book. You are going to hear about it.
And so they are incentivized for that book to succeed.
Right. I mean, I should be careful here. It's not always a book they've paid a lot of money for. It can be a book that after it's in and edited has galvanized an entire publishing house that everybody wants to get behind.
Okay, so you're here to talk about a bunch of books that are coming out between now and May, some of which you've read, some of which you've read pieces of, and some of which you haven't, but we have expectations that the book will at least be a book that people are talking about. The first one is a fairly obvious one. It's going to come out right around the time that this podcast drops, and it is called Victory City, and it's by Salman Rushdie. Probably don't need to explain who that is, but I'd love, Tina, for you to tell me about what this book is about, the moment that it's arriving, and why we think it's going to be one that people are talking about.
So the novel is arriving in kind of this stunning moment, mere months after a knife-wielding attacker rushed him on the stage at a literary event and grievously injured him. Just to remind that following the 1989 publication of his novel The Satanic Verses, Rushdie had to spend years in hiding because of the fatwa issued against him. In this last decade or so, he's lived this big public life, especially in New York City. Those of us who go to book parties and book events have seen him. He's out. He goes to restaurants. He goes to parties. Even though he has said all along he's dealing with these threats against his safety. So the theme of the new novel would seem to be storytellers and stories outlast everything else, governments and empires and wars. For Rushdie, who's sort of like the ultimate free speech icon, to be delivering this novel at this time, it's just a moment, and it is timely. It's also a really good novel, and I think that what is interesting about that is that there have been a lot of naysayers who said for years, oh, all of his best work was pre-fatwa. People cite Midnight's Children, and people say, oh, it's so clear that the fatwa and living in hiding have affected his creative processes have affected his work. I mean, how could it not, for one thing? But this is a novel in which he's proving those naysayers wrong.
For those of our listeners who haven't been keeping up, can you provide a very brief update as to his condition? What do we know about how he's doing?
We know that he's doing better. We know that he's in rehab, but doing it at home and not in a hospital setting, and that he's improving, and that by all accounts from his agent, from his friends, like he's funny, he's talking like he's not diminished in any way.
But it is almost certain that we're not going to see him out promoting this book because he's still ailing.
Right.
So that's Victory City by Salman Rushdie, and that is out February 7th. A book that's coming out a month later on March 7th is Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton. What can you tell us about this book?
A little bit of backstory on Catton first. For those of you who don't remember her, and you might not because it's been more than a dozen years since her last book, The Luminaries, it won the Booker Prize, and she was the youngest ever winner of the Booker Prize, and that was a historical novel set in the 19th century goldfields of New Zealand. The new book, Birnam Wood, is also set in New Zealand, but it's contemporary, and it's being billed as a psychological thriller. I've only just dipped in, but in a nutshell, it's about the conflict between this shady guerrilla gardening collective, don't laugh, and an American billionaire who wants to build his end times bunker on the island. And they both have their sights on the same piece of land.
And what is Birnam Wood?
Well, you and I were having this discussion earlier. I mean, it's a Shakespearean allusion. It comes from Macbeth. And you said it better than me. Basically, Macbeth is told that he's safe until Birnam Wood moves.
One of the witches, one of the weird sisters tells him, hey, you're cool, but if Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, you're out of luck.
And so then Macduff's army cuts branches from trees to disguise themselves.
Spoilers for Macbeth. He gets his head cut off. The next book we're going to talk about is totally contemporary. It is set in Brooklyn, in New York, and it's called Pineapple Street, and it's by Jenny Jackson. There's a book that is out March 1st.
So this novel is about three very different sisters in a waspy Brooklyn Heights family. Anyone who's familiar with Brooklyn Heights knows that the streets are named for different fruits in places. There's Cranberry Street, there's Orange Street, and there's Pineapple Street. What's interesting about this book is that Jackson is an editor at Knopf, which is an imprint of Random House, one of the biggest publishers in America. You've probably heard of a lot of the authors she herself has edited: J. Courtney Sullivan, Jennifer Close, the aforementioned Emily St. John Mandel. This is what I call a rich person novel. And I will say that for me, the appeal of rich people novels are that they're a chance to see how the other half lives and to step inside houses I'm never going to get invited to. And this family, I must add, is so dysfunctional and these people so screwed up that you don't feel any jealousy.
And when we say how the other half lives, we mean the other 2%.
Right.
Essentially.
Right.
Okay.
1%.
Yeah. Like 0.5%.
0.5%.
That sounds great. As someone who lived in New York for a very long time and has walked by many of those Brooklyn Heights brownstones, I will probably read it with great jealousy. The next book on our list is the complete opposite. It is a nonfiction book, and it deals with people that are far, far, far from rich. Can you tell us about this book?
Matthew Desmond is the author of a book called Evicted, which followed 8 families who were struggling to pay rent in Milwaukee. That was a big deal book. It was one of our best books of the year. So this new book called Poverty by America clearly grew out of the research he was doing for his last book. And it's a book that asks, why does poverty not only exist, but continue to grow in one of the richest countries on earth? And Desmond says he didn't have a satisfactory theory or explanation. I haven't gotten any further in this book, but I've read Evicted, which was a stunning piece of narrative nonfiction, richly reported.
So that's Poverty by America by the author Matthew Desmond, and that's out March 21st. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm here with Tina Jordan, Deputy Editor of the Book Review, and we are going to talk about a book by an author that I'm particularly excited about. He is a guy who I spoke to on this podcast many years ago in summer 2018. We were both here talking about the work of Stephen King, an author who was extremely formative in both of our lives. A year before, he had written his well-received novel, The Changeling. Tina, what can you tell us about Lone Women by Victor LaValle?
LaValle has talked for a long time about his love not just of Stephen King, but Shirley Jackson and H.P. Lovecraft and Angela Carter, to name just a few. And when I was getting ready for this interview today, I went back and read something that he had written in which he said, as a child, and this is a quote, "I liked the stuff that suggested things are beyond our reckoning. Human beings are limited beings and we can't grasp or fathom everything that this universe has to offer. I was just drawn to that." And I'm giving you this quote because that is what you come away from with Lone Women, which is a work of historical horror. I'm going to give you just like the briefest possible recap without giving anything away. In 1915, a young Black woman flees her home in California after the death of her parents, deaths she may have had a hand in, and she heads to Montana where she can claim a homestead. And she's traveling with this vast steamer trunk that is never allowed to be opened. If it is, people around her vanish and or worse things happen.
I have a big smile on my face because I read a lot for this job now, but I'm particularly excited by this one and this concept. Our next title seems like it may be a book of horror, and in many ways it is. It's essentially a book-length essay called Monsters by Claire Dederer, and it has to do with real-life monsters. What can you tell us about this one?
So in 2017, Dederer wrote an essay for the Paris Review titled, "What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men?" with grappled with people like Roman Polanski and Woody Allen, people who have made pieces of art that are acknowledged to be great, but who have also been accused of doing awful and terrible things. Some people say don't watch their shows, don't read their books. Others do, but feel conflicted about it. So that article is clearly the jumping off point for Monsters, which is sort of arriving at the perfect moment in our cancel everyone culture. I will say she's widened her lens considerably. There are a lot of women, for example, in this book. For example, Valerie Solanas, Sylvia Plath is another. I'm reading this book now, and what strikes me is Dederer makes clear that the way you consume art doesn't make you a bad person. But I actually stopped and wrote down this quote because the heart of the book is this. Here's what she writes. "When what you like becomes important, becomes defining, becomes an obsession, then an artist's biography has even more clout, more power than before. You have not just admired, not just consumed the art, you've become it."
Our next book is by someone who I love. He's a great writer of narrative nonfiction. Several of his books have been made into films, including The Lost City of Z, The Old Man and the Gun, and this year's Killers of the Flower Moon, which after what seems like several years is actually going to finally come out. It's Martin Scorsese working yet again with Leonardo DiCaprio. His name is David Grann, great author, and his new book is The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder. This one is out in mid-April. Tell us about this one.
This is nautical, historical, true crime from 300 years ago.
I'm sold.
I'm sold too. Look, if you think, how could a writer possibly do this? Let me tell you, the historical record can be mined in great detail, like diaries, articles, like there's a lot more out there than you would have thought. And if anybody can mine it, it's David Grann. So The Wager takes its name from a British warship that sank off the coast of Patagonia in 1741. And months after it went down, a ragtag bunch of emaciated sailors showed up in a boat, said they were the survivors. They got a hero's welcome. And then shortly after that, another boat arrived, and they had a very different story. And who were the mutineers? Who were the murderers? I'm guessing that's how it's going to unfold. I do have a friend who's read the whole thing. I'm jealous, who said it's like being inside a Patrick O'Brian novel.
Tina, you have one more book that you want to talk about. It comes out in early May. It's a book by an author who hasn't had one in quite a while. What is the name of this book, and who is the author?
So this book is The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese, and it's been more than a decade since his last book, Cutting for Stone, which was a huge bestseller in like 2010, 11. Maybe the reason he hasn't had a book since then is that he's also a doctor, and he works as a doctor. So there's certainly lots of doctors who write not just nonfiction, but fiction. But Verghese, at least in Cutting for Stone, was so informed by his work as a doctor. And by that, I mean, as a doctor, he teaches at Stanford. What he's famous for is teaching medical students how to perform a bedside exam. And he's very famous for saying, don't look at the computer. Don't look at the notes on the computer. Look at the patient in the bed. The patient is the text. And the kind of eye for detail, the empathy that clearly drive him as a doctor, that's what made Cutting for Stone shine the way that it did. And I think one of the reasons I'm most excited about this book is that there's clearly an autobiographical element at play here. It's about 3 generations in one family, a family that's beset by an odd curse, and it's set in Kerala, which is in southern India on the coast. And Verghese himself is from a small Christian community in Kerala, very much like the one in the book. And he mentioned in an interview a few months ago that the main character of the book, the family matriarch, is modeled on his own great-grandmother.
I think I've seen a galley for this book in the office. Galleys are advanced copies of books. It looks pretty big.
Cutting for Stone was big too, but can I tell you on the first page of Cutting for Stone, a Catholic nun dies giving birth to conjoined twins. And you just can't put it down from there. 800, 900 pages, I'm not sure what it was. It was a great yarn.
I don't know how to respond to that. I don't know that I'm going to go back and read that. But listeners, there may be some of you who are interested. I don't know how to respond to that.
Who are intrigued. All right, fine.
Who are intrigued.
So, Gilbert, I know there's a book you're excited about as well.
There is. It's because I'm pretty basic. And I love movies. I love the Oscars. We're firmly in Oscar season right now. The Oscars this year are in mid-March. And there's a book that comes out near the end of February called Oscar Wars, and it's by Michael Schulman. He's one of the New Yorker's more prolific celebrity profilers. If you read The New Yorker regularly, you've definitely read him, but he maybe is most famous in the past few years for writing a profile of Jeremy Strong, who's one of the stars of Succession. And it was a profile that really divided people. Some people thought it was very clear-eyed about a very peculiar man. And there were others, particularly those who were friends with Jeremy Strong or those in the acting community, who thought it was a pretty unfair approach to take about someone who is extremely devoted to his craft. So that's all to say, if you haven't read the Jeremy Strong profile, definitely check it out. Michael Schulman has his book now on the Oscars. Each of the chapters in the book, there's 11, is devoted to a particular Oscar ceremony or an era that is dramatic or indicative of shifts that happen in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So just to mention a few, there's 1941 when famously Citizen Kane lost the Best Picture race to How Green Was My Valley, and the sisters Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland faced off against each other in the Best Actress race. There's the absolutely insane year of 1976 when these are the films that were nominated for Best Picture. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Barry Lyndon, Jaws, Nashville, and Dog Day Afternoon. It's sort of this pivot point between New Hollywood and the blockbuster era. Of course, there's the year when the Harvey Weinstein-led campaign for Shakespeare in Love resulted in that movie winning Best Picture over Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, which many consider to be a superior film. They're both good, but maybe one is better than the other. And one only won because what we now know as a very bad man, had pioneered this way, these campaigns where he just pumped money into making sure that his movies were the ones that were going to end up on top. There's a ton in there for anyone that's interested in movies, movie history. I'm particularly excited about it. This is not the only book I'm excited about, but it's one I felt compelled to mention, given that I feel like a lot of people are in Oscar catch-up mode at the moment. So that's my book. You've read so many more than I, which is why I'm glad you are here to talk to me and to talk to our listeners about some that you think we should be paying attention to. So thank you, Tina, for joining today on our first podcast back after a very long break. It's a delight to talk to you every day and to talk to you about these books.
It's my pleasure.
That was my conversation with Tina Jordan, the deputy editor of the New York Times Book Review, about some forthcoming big books that she and I are both excited for and that you'll probably be hearing about. For the New York Times, I'm Gilbert Cruz. Thank you for listening.